and welcome to BNC Sports. I'm James Hill. NFL Week 2, Vikings at Colts. Phillips Rivers making his Indianapolis home debut. Jonathan Taylor gaining 101 yards and one score. Touchdown there. Kirk Cousins with 3 interceptions. Colts 28, Vikings 11, your final. Greg Coleman is a former Florida A&M punter. Coleman played for the NFL Minnesota Vikings from 1978 through 87. He joins us live from Minneapolis in this BNC Sports exclusive. Greg, talk about Week 2 and what your assessment is as we think about Week 2 and the game against the Colts.
Well, James, last week we said that the loss to the Packers, one game does not make a season. Well, 0-2 does not make a season either. Boy, but it really puts you behind the 8 ball when you go 0-2. Coming up next week, you got the Tennessee Titans. But more than anything else, coaches and players both talked about the disappointment of giving up over 100 yards again 2 weeks in a row, not being able to stop the run, but also not being able to establish the run, the consistencies that are needed in the running game, the passing game, and defensively, we're not there. They just have not been there for the last 2 weeks for this football team. Although, Kirk Cousins did not have his best day. 3 picks, as you mentioned, but we've had 2 safeties in a row. Last week, it was a play-action pass, backed up in your own end zone. I questioned that call today. A 5-step drop in your end zone, winding up with 2 safeties in a row. That just cannot happen, especially after the defense does a great job with a goal line stance against the Packers last weekend in stopping the Colts today inside of their own 5-yard line. So those are some of the things, those are some of the disappointments that this team has got to be faced with. But the reality is, as much talent as this football team has, it's not playing good football right now.
When you look at Cousins and his opportunity to get the ball to a young fella in Jefferson, who we know out of LSU, and also when we think about the running game of the Vikings and Mr. Cook, talk about both of those gentlemen and the opportunity to show and prove going into Week 3.
Well, I've always said that Dalvin Cook is the straw that stirs the drink for the Minnesota Vikings. People talk about the quarterback, and that is a important position. But for this offense, it's Dalvin Cook. If we get the running game going, if we establish that early on, now that opens up the play-action pass. It gives Kirk time to find receivers down the field. Now, because Adam Thielen is his go-to guy, it's his insurance policy. That sometimes gives a quarterback an opportunity to lock in on a receiver instead of really going through your progression, finding the open receiver. And that's some of what happened today. But Dalvin Cook, without question, is the cat's meow for this offense.
Now, the Twin Cities have been going through a very challenging episode, if you will, when we look at the Floyd case. Take us to the current climate in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
Well, I think it's still tedious. My wife and I drove down to 38th in Chicago just this weekend, and it's still fresh. I mean, the memories of what happened in that incident when Mr. Floyd's life was taken from him. And I think back and I look at what our team has been doing over the years. Now, our social justice committee just did not evolve over the last several months. That committee of players and coaches has been intact for years and years and years. We've been having dialogue and conversations, developing relationships with law enforcement in the Twin Cities area. Our social justice committee has made a decision to award Mimi, a young African-American lady, with the first George Floyd Legacy Scholarship Award. Last Sunday against the Green Bay Packers, when we opened up, you had coaches and players and administrators locking arms as we honored the George Floyd family, who was the guest of the Minnesota Vikings. Our ownership understands, and they believe that our players and the voices around the National Football League, the NBA, WNBA, can be the voice of change. So we are right on the forefront, right at the tipping point of trying to do whatever we can. And other teams around the National Football League are making statements, and owners are making demands on legislators and politicians to really, let's make a change. Let's be about the change.
Greg, let's shift gears. HBCU football. When we look at the highest of 7 hills, we see $10 million coming down the pike to improve the Bragg Stadium. Talk about that from your perspective, as you spent many times on that field as a student athlete, as a Rattler.
I applaud those politicians and the school administrators for finding a way to be creative, to find the funding. I mean, it was a $40 million budget that was slated for a convention center on the campus of FSU. But, you know, coming together, that's what happens when you have conversation, coming together, talking about what makes sense for Florida A&M. I think it was a great move, and I so applaud everyone in the Tallahassee region. Also, another big point, James, this weekend, Deion Sanders, Hall of Fame cornerback, was named the head coach of Jackson State. That does amazing things for HBCU football, because now when Deion Sanders goes into the house in the home of these young African-American players, and he sits down and talks with moms and dads, they know and understand that Deion cares about them, not only as a student athlete, but as a human being, and they can put their best foot forward. So another big kudos for HBCUs, regardless whether it's Jackson State or not. Same church, different pew.
Next fall, a big-time game down in South Florida, Jackson State and FAMU.
Well, with Deion Sanders being the coach, and I know what Coach Simmons is doing up at Florida A&M, it's going to be one heck of a game. And depending on schedules, that's one game that I'm going to try and make. But again, big-time college football coming back to HBCUs.
There he is, folks. He is Greg Coleman. Coming up later, NFL highlights, Major League Baseball, and the NBA news. Also exclusive HBCU sports content only right here on Black News Channel.